Well, as the song says, if there's a place of joy and peace near the heart of God, the world is not close to God's heart.
This moment. Yeah.
If you've been watching the news the last week, you have seen the troubles that's all over the place in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, in France, in Tunisia, and other places as well. Probably the philosophy of the world could be summed up in two statements which George Santayana made a number of years ago. He was a philosopher who was born in Spain, educated in the US, and taught for a while at Harvard. And he made these two famous statements. Those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it. And the second was, nonsense is so good because common sense is so limited. Think about those for a minute. Because those are the philosophies by which many people live. People don't learn by their mistakes. They don't learn by what has happened in past times. People who drink and drive are often caught 2 and 3 times for the same problems. They don't learn. Conversely, people who find out something good happens to them often don't repeat whatever made that good thing to happen. It's amazing how many people come to church, make friends, get help, get assistance, get support, and then disappear. It's amazing. People don't learn in the past. And we're no different today than the Hebrews were thousands of years ago. Back in the garden, they had everything except one restriction. And of course, Satan tempted them with that one restriction, saying, didn't God say you could eat everything in the garden? And they fell for it. The consequences were such that they had all sorts of troubles from that point on. But did they learn from it? No. Many years later, in slavery in Egypt, they complained because they were neglected by God and not being rescued. So God rescued them through Moses. Were they happy to get out of Egypt? They were barely gone when they complained about Moses taking them into the desert to die. They were better off in Egypt. They complained so much that God left them in the wilderness for 40 years so that they could learn a total reliance upon Him. He gave them manna to eat. They complained because they didn't have any meat. He gave them quail to eat. They complained because they didn't have any water. They complained and complained and complained. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, or was credited with writing the first 5 books of the Bible. And he summed it up in Deuteronomy when he gave the adage to the Hebrews. And if you have a Bible, just follow along with me. Because in Deuteronomy 30, verse 15, he says this, see, I have set before you this day life and good, and death and evil. And that I command you this day to love Jehovah your God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His commandments, and His statutes, and His ordinances, that you may live and multiply, and that God may bless you in the land. You'd think after all that they'd been through, that they would have listened to this. Not only had they been brought through the desert, not only had they been brought through a number of battles, not only had they sort of given in to the temptations of the Moabites, but they'd come through that. And Moses was given them the last instructions before he died. But that was not enough. He gave them this, and then in the very next chapter, in chapter 31, he says this in verse 20, verse 26. For I know your rebellion and your stiff neck. Behold, while I am yet alive, you have been rebellious against God. And how much more after my death? I know that after my death you will be utterly corrupt yourselves and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you. And evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do that which is evil in the sight of God, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. After all they'd been through, they still didn't get the point. When Moses died, he transferred his authority to Joshua, who took the people across into the Promised Land. Now, there were many battles to fight. The people in the Promised Land didn't want to give it up without a fight. God may have given the Promised Land to the Hebrews, but the people there didn't agree with it. So they fought. And Joshua and God got them through the battles. And God had told them to destroy or to get rid of or to expel all the peoples in the land. However, they didn't do that. Go over to Joshua chapter 24. Joshua, in his turn, also was dying. And he had taken the Hebrews into the land. He had divided the land among the tribes. And he was now giving his instructions to the Hebrews. Now, they'd been through this many times. Each time they fell back again. Each time they gave way to the old ways that they had been used to before. One of the reasons we give in to temptation is the fact that we are not tempted as much to do good as to do evil. And part of the reason for that comes from James, because James says God does not tempt. The tempter is the devil. Okay? So we're tempted to do evil more than good. So Joshua gives this admonition in verse 14, chapter 24. Now therefore fear God, and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve Jehovah. And if it seem evil unto you to serve Jehovah, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve God. And the people answered and said, Far be it from us that we should forsake Jehovah to serve other gods. For Jehovah our God, He is the one that brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, and did those great things in our sight, and preserved us in all the way wherein we went, and among all the peoples through the midst of whom we passed. And Jehovah drove out from before us all the peoples, even the Amorites, that dwelt in the land. Therefore we also will serve God, serve Jehovah, for he is our God. And Joshua said unto the people, If you forsake Jehovah and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you evil and consume you. After that, he has done you good. The people said, No, we will serve God. And Joshua said, You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen you, Jehovah, to serve him. And they said, We are witnesses. People make pledges all the time to do things for God and then go back on them. Here, the Hebrews, after so many battles, after so much trial and tribulation, were making their pledge to serve only God. However, the Canaanites that were in the land, God had told them to drive out. They did not. The reason being, the Canaanites didn't want to go out. Therefore, okay, just stay. And as a result, compromised them. Whenever there's a difference, whenever there's compromises made, troubles begin. And it wasn't until the second chapter of the next book that this happens. Look in chapter 11, or to chapter 2, verse 11. And the children of Israel did that which was evil in the sight of Jehovah, and served Balaam. This is Judges chapter 2. And they forsook Jehovah, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, the gods of the peoples that were found around them, and bowed themselves down unto them, and they provoked Jehovah to anger. And the anger of God was kindled against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that despoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. People have a habit of not learning from the past. If you don't learn and listen to the past, then you're going to repeat it. The Hebrews did this many times. Many times God rescued them. Many times they fell back. And usually because they were tempted to compromise. It says at the very last of the book of Judges, in Judges chapter 21, the very last line, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. The book of Judges was written apparently by Samuel, and tells the decline of the Hebrews away from their victories under Joshua into the hands of many enemies. We have no choice but to read and to listen to some of this, because this is our history. And if we don't listen to what the history says, we're going to repeat it. If you look at the world around us, you can see that it's happening right now. People don't learn from their past. And unfortunately, one of the least common senses we have is common sense. It would help us out of a lot of these problems if we pay attention to our history and use some of the brain power which God initially gave us. Just something to think about.